Welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we untangle the threads of fascinating books and ideas. I'm your host, James, and boy, do we have a heavy hitter today. We're diving headfirst into part one of Viktor Frankl's incredibly powerful book, Man's Search for Meaning. Specifically, the section titled Experiences in a Concentration Camp. It's intense, but profoundly important. And to help us navigate this, I've got my absolute favorite people here. Returning to the pod, the wonderful Sarah, who's really steeped herself in Frankl's account for us.
Hey James, happy to be back. Although happy feels like a slightly weird word for today's topic, but definitely ready to talk about it. It's a book that just stays with you.
Totally understand. And rounding out our trio, the ever insightful, sometimes provocative, Dr. Ethan.
James, Sarah, always a pleasure to apply a little scientific detachment, even when the subject matter resists easy analysis. And this certainly does.
Right? Okay, so part one. Frankl, a psychiatrist, finds himself in Auschwitz, not as a doctor initially, but as just another number. Sarah, can you set the scene? What hits these prisoners first?
Yeah, absolutely. Frankl breaks it down into roughly 3 psychological phases for the inmates. And the first one? It's just raw shock, pure, unadulterated shock. He talks about the train journey, the rumor, the dread, and then seeing the sign Auschwitz. Just the name itself, he says, stood for all that was horrible.
I can't even imagine that moment, seeing the sign.
Exactly. And then the arrival, the shouting, the shaved heads, the striped uniforms. Interestingly, Frankl mentions this initial, tiny flicker of what he calls delusion of reprieve, seeing some prisoners looking well-fed, even having a dark sense of humor. Maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be that bad. Like a condemned man hoping for a last-minute pardon.
That delusion of reprieve is a fascinating psychological defense mechanism, isn't it? The mind clinging to straws, trying to normalize the absolutely abnormal. It buffers the initial psychic impact. However, briefly
is the word. Because then comes the selection. The SS officer, the casual point of a finger, left or right. Left meant the crematorium, usually within hours. Frankl gets sent to the right work. He finds out later that night what happened to his friend P, who went left. You can see him there, someone says, pointing to the chimney, floating up to heaven.
Oh man, just stark. And this is all part of that initial shock phase?
Absolutely. Then the stripping away, literally. Leave luggage, hand over watches, valuables. Frankl tries desperately to save the manuscript of his life's work, his scientific book. He explains this to an older prisoner, asking if he understands how vital it is. The prisoner's reply? Just one word. Shit! And Frankl says in that moment he saw the plain truth and struck out his whole former life.
Wow. That single word just cuts through everything.
it signifies the complete inversion of values, doesn't it? Intellectual achievement, personal history, rendered utterly meaningless in the face of bare survival. That crude word is the gateway to the new reality.
Then the shaving, head, entire body, the showers, the terrifying moment of wondering if it's water or gas, and the grim relief when it's actually water. He says they had nothing left but their naked existence. It's profound. What remains when everything, absolutely everything, is taken?
Except, Frankl says something else remains, right? Even later, when things get worse.
Yes, and that's the core insight that starts to emerge, even through the horror. But first comes the second phase, apathy. A sort of emotional death, a necessary protective shell. Frankl describes seeing beatings, punishments, people dying, and eventually, just watching unmoved. The constant exposure just blunts your feelings.
A classic trauma response. Emotional numbing. When the stimuli are overwhelming and constant, the psyche shuts down certain affective circuits to conserve energy and prevent complete disintegration. It's adaptive, in a grim way.
Totally. He talks about disgust fading too. Cleaning latrines, getting splashed with excrement, reacting only brought punishment. Pity, horror. These emotions became luxuries they couldn't afford. He even describes watching, quite detachedly, as fellow prisoners strip a still warm corpse of shoes, scraps of food, even string.
Good grief. It sounds like they were just reduced to animals, fighting for scraps.
Frankl touches on that. He says a person could forget his human dignity and become no more than an animal in the fight for self-preservation. But crucially, he insists this wasn't inevitable. There was another path.
This regression to a more primitive mental state is often observed in extreme conditions. The focus narrows entirely to basic needs, as Maslow might predict. Frankl mentions the obsessive talk about food, the dreams of bread and cake and warm baths. The higher needs seem to evaporate.
Yeah, the food talk. He seemed to think that was almost dangerous, stirring up desires you couldn't satisfy.
He debated its value, but it highlights that primal focus. He even mentions the near total absence of the sexual urge, which you might expect in an all-male environment. The sheer undernourishment and stress just extinguished it, apparently.
So, shock, then this deep apathy, where does the shift happen? How does anyone maintain humanity in that?
Well, alongside the apathy, Frankl describes an intensification of the inner life for some. Those sensitive people, used to a rich intellectual life, while perhaps physically more delicate, could retreat inwards. They found spiritual freedom.
Which is paradoxical. You'd intuitively assume the robust nature would fare better, but Frankl suggests inner resources provided a different kind of resilience. A capacity for dissociation, perhaps, or finding internal meaning structures.
Exactly. He gives that incredibly moving example of marching to work in the freezing cold, thinking of his wife, imagining her, conversing with her in his mind. He realizes love is the ultimate and highest goal, that salvation is through love and in love. Whether she was even alive ceased to matter. The love itself, the inner image, sustained him.
That's incredibly beautiful amidst such ugliness.
And it wasn't just love. It was appreciation for beauty, too. He describes prisoners moved to tears by a sunset over the Bavarian woods, seen through the bars of a prison train, or finding solace in nature, like the story of the dying woman who found friendship in a chestnut tree branch outside her window, saying it told her, "I am here, I am here, I am life, eternal life."
These peak experiences, moments of transcendence, seem crucial. They offer a frame of reference beyond the immediate squalor and suffering. Finding beauty or love connects the individual to something larger, something the camp couldn't entirely extinguish.
And humor. He talks about developing a grim sense of humor as, quote, another of the soul's weapons, making jokes about future dinner parties where they might ask the hostess to ladle soup from the bottom, like in camp. It creates distance, a way to rise above the situation, even for seconds.
Humor in Auschwitz. It seems impossible.
Humor is often about incongruity. And what's more incongruous than trying to maintain human dignity in hell? It's a sophisticated cognitive tool for reframing, for asserting control over one's internal state when external control is nil.
And this all leads to Frankl's central argument, the one that defines his whole philosophy, logotherapy. He quotes Nietzsche, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." Finding a meaning, a purpose, was the key to survival, not just physically, but spiritually.
The why? So it could be love? Like for his wife?
Yes, or it could be work. Frankl himself reconstructed his manuscript in his head, or it could be finding meaning in suffering itself. He says suffering is meaningless until we give it meaning by how we respond, by choosing our attitude.
Which brings us to that last of the human freedoms. Even when everything else is stripped away, possessions, dignity, health, even life itself is threatened constantly. Frankl argues you retain the freedom to choose how you respond to your circumstances.
He saw it happen. The prisoners who comforted others, who gave away their last bread, they proved it was possible. Their character wasn't just a product of the camp, it was an inner decision. They chose to be, quote, worthy of their sufferings.
But even realistically, under that kind of pressure, with starvation, exhaustion, constant fear, how much choice does someone truly have? Isn't that asking a lot?
That's the critical question, James. From a purely deterministic viewpoint, extreme physiological and psychological stress severely constrains choice. Trauma can fundamentally alter brain function and personality. Frankl's perspective is more existential, emphasizing this irreducible core of human freedom. He acknowledges only a few achieved this high moral standard, but insists that, quote, even one such example is sufficient proof. It's perhaps less a statement about universal capability under duress and more about the potential that exists, the ideal to strive for. It's aspirational almost.
But Frankl saw the alternative too. He describes the Muslims, those who gave up, lost hope in the future. They declined mentally and physically, often very quickly. He tells that chilling story of his friend F, the composer, who dreamt he'd be liberated on March 30th. When that date approached and liberation seemed unlikely, he fell ill and died. On March 31st, his loss of hope seemed to make him succumb.
The mind-body connection laid bare, terrifyingly.
Indeed, psychoneuroimmunology explores these links. Profound hopelessness and despair can impact immune function. While correlation isn't causation, Frankl's observation about the spike in deaths after Christmas, when hoped-for liberation didn't materialize, is suggestive of a powerful psychosomatic effect.
So the antidote, Frankl says, is finding that why, that future goal. But he also flips the script on the meaning of life itself, doesn't he?
Yes, this is huge. He says we need to stop asking what we expect from life and start asking what life expects from us. Life is questioning us, daily and hourly. Our answer isn't talk, but right action, right conduct. Finding and fulfilling the unique tasks life sets for us.
That's a powerful reframe. Responsibility, not entitlement.
Exactly. And that task might be creative work, or experiencing love or beauty, or, sometimes, simply accepting fate and bearing your cross with dignity. That itself becomes your unique task, your opportunity for meaning.
Okay, wow, there's so much there. Let's pause for a moment and talk about our sponsor for this episode, Magis Institute in Singapore. Now, it might seem like a leap from the concentration camps to creative media education, but stick with me. Frankl's whole point is about finding purpose, about having a why, a future goal that pulls you through the toughest how. It's about building something, even if it starts in your mind, like Frankl reconstructing his manuscript. Magis Institute equips people with practical, industry-focused skills in fields like game design, game art, concept art. It helps people build their future, find their why in these exciting creative fields. If you're passionate about games or art and looking for that path forward, Magis provides hands-on training, expert instructors, and strong industry connections.
Absolutely. Frankl emphasizes finding meaning through work, doing something significant. For those drawn to creative industries, Magis offers a very concrete way to pursue that, to build a fulfilling career. Definitely check them out at magis.edu.sg.
And from a psychological perspective, engaging in creative work, mastering skills, achieving goals, these are powerful sources of self-efficacy and meaning, counteracting the kind of apathy Frankl described. It's about shaping your world, not just being shaped by it. Worth investigating if that's your field. magis.edu.sg.
Thanks, guys. That's magis.edu.sg. Find your why in the creative world. Okay, back to Frankl. Before we get to the wrap-up, let's take a few questions that have come in. First one here. Frankl's idea of choosing your attitude is inspiring but feels almost superhuman. Were there moments Frankl himself admitted struggling with this, showing irritability or despair? Sarah?
Oh, absolutely. Frankl is very honest about this. He explicitly describes feeling intense irritability, especially when dealing with apathetic, feverish patients as a doctor/block warden. He admits feeling his fists clench, the struggle not to strike out. He talks about being disgusted with thinking only of trivial things, like trading cigarettes for soup. He even confesses later that he feels he, quote, must have missed many opportunities to comfort fellow prisoners because he lacked the inner strength at times. He wasn't portraying himself as a saint, but as a human, grappling with inhuman conditions, striving for that inner freedom.
Okay, that makes it feel more attainable somehow. Next question. The book mentions the bitterness and disillusionment some survivors felt upon returning home. Could Ethan elaborate on the psychological reasons for this difficult reentry?
Certainly. It's a complex phenomenon. Firstly, there's the massive gap in experience. Survivors return from an unimaginable reality to a world that carried on, a world that often struggles to comprehend or even acknowledge the depth of their suffering. Phrases like, "we didn't know," or "we suffered too," however well-intentioned, can feel dismissive and invalidating, leading to bitterness and alienation. Secondly, disillusionment with fate, the expectation, perhaps unconscious, that surviving hell should be rewarded with some measure of peace or happiness. Instead, they might face further loss, discovering loved ones perished, finding their homes gone, their old lives irrecoverable. This adds another layer of trauma, the realization that suffering doesn't inoculate you against further pain. Rebuilding a sense of safety and trust in the world and in human connection can be an incredibly long and arduous process after such profound trauma and betrayal.
Makes sense. It wasn't just over when they walked out the gates. Okay, final question. In the preface, Frankl tells the story of choosing to stay with his parents rather than take an American visa based on a fragment of the Ten Commandments. How does this personal decision relate to his later philosophy developed in the camps?
I think it's foundational. That decision, made before the camps, embodies the very principles he later articulated. He was faced with a choice: pursue his, quote, brainchild, logotherapy, in safety, or fulfill his responsibility as a child to his parents. The hint from heaven, the marble inscribed, "Honor thy father and thy mother," helped him clarify his values and choose responsibility, a concrete task life was setting for him in that moment, over personal ambition or even safety. It shows that finding meaning often involves surrender to a cult greater than oneself, or a person other than oneself, as he says. His philosophy wasn't just an intellectual exercise born from the camps. It was rooted in the choices he made before and during them.
Powerful connection. Okay, amazing discussion. As we wrap up this deep dive into part 1, Sarah, could you crystallize the main takeaways for us?
Sure. I think there are a few key things from this part. First, the brutal reality of the camps forced extreme psychological adaptation, the initial shock giving way to apathy as a defense mechanism. Second, despite the dehumanizing conditions, an inner life could flourish through love, memory, beauty, and even humor. Third, and most crucially, Frankl's core insight, that even when all external freedoms are lost, the ultimate freedom, to choose one's attitude, to find meaning in one's response to suffering, remains. Fourth, the vital importance of having a future goal, a why, to endure the how. And finally, the redefinition of life's meaning, not what we expect from life, but what life expects from us, the unique tasks it sets.
Perfect summary. Heavy stuff, but so important. Thank you, Sarah, for guiding us through that with such clarity, and Ethan for your sharp insights as always.
My pleasure, James. It's important stuff to grapple with.
Indeed, Frankl's work remains profoundly relevant.
All right, folks, that's all the penplexity we have time for today. What book or topic should we tackle next? Let us know. Find us on social media at penplexity, that's PENPLEXITY, and check out our website, penplexity.com. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and keep questioning. Bye for now. Hello, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we dive headfirst into the wonderfully complex world of books and ideas. I'm your host, James, and today, oh boy, today we're tackling a big one. We're jumping into part 2 of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, the section called Logotherapy in a Nutshell. And who better to help us unpack this than our resident bookworm and all-around ray of sunshine, Sarah?
Hey, James. Sunshine reporting for duty. Yeah, this chapter is dense, but so good. Frankl basically lays out his whole therapeutic philosophy. It's fascinating.
Dense is an understatement. Thankfully, we also have our favorite skeptical scientist, Ethan, here to keep us grounded.
Grounded, or perhaps analytically levitating? Hello all. Frankl's work is certainly influential, though separating the philosophy from the testable psychotherapy can be interesting.
See? Perfect balance. Okay, Sarah, nutshell me. What is logotherapy? Frankl tells that funny story about the American doctor.
Right. The doctor asks for a one-sentence summary, and Frankl compares it to psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis. The patient must lie down and tell you things which sometimes are very disagreeable to tell. Logotherapy. The patient may remain sitting erect, but he must hear things which sometimes are very disagreeable to hear. He says it's facetious, but it kind of gets at something, right? Logotherapy is less about digging deep deep into your past traumas, like Freudian psychoanalysis, and more focused on the future. It's about the meaning you need to find and fulfill in your life going forward. It's meaning-centered.
And that sitting erect versus lying down isn't just posture, is it? It implies a more active, conscious engagement with the therapist in the process, rather than purely introspective free association. Logotherapy wants to defocus those neurotic feedback loops, break the self-centeredness.
Okay, so less navel-gazing, more horizon scanning? Frankl calls this primary drive the will to meaning. How's that different from, say, Freud's pleasure principle or Adler's will to power?
Exactly. Frankl argues that our deepest, most fundamental drive isn't just seeking pleasure or power. It's seeking meaning. He believes this is the primary motivation. He even cites polls, like one in France where 89% said man needs something to live for, and 61% had something they'd die for. And that Johns Hopkins study? 78% of students rated, quote, finding purpose and meaning as their top goal, way above making money.
Those polls are suggestive, certainly, though establishing it as the primary biological or psychological drive empirically is challenging. How do you measure a will to meaning against, say, basic survival instincts or the pleasure drive, which have clearer neurobiological correlates? Frankl acknowledges some might see values as, quote, defense mechanisms, but he strongly refutes that.
He really does. He says, I would not be willing to live merely for the sake of my defense mechanisms, nor would I be ready to die merely for the sake of my, quote, reaction formations. Man, however, is able to live and even to die for the sake of his ideals and values. He thinks psychologists who try to unmask everything sometimes just reveal their own need to devalue what's genuinely human.
Okay, so if this will to meaning is so strong, what happens when it gets blocked? Like when you just can't find any meaning?
That's what Frankl calls existential frustration. And he uses existential in 3 ways, referring to existence itself, the meaning of existence, and our striving to find that meaning. When that striving is frustrated, it can lead to what he terms, quote, noogenic neuroses.
Noogenic, from the Greek nous, meaning mind, but specifically referring to the human dimension, distinct from purely psychological or instinctual conflicts. Frankl argues these neuroses need logotherapy specifically, not just general psychotherapy, because their root isn't in repressed drives, but in this frustration of meaning.
He gives that example of the American diplomat, right? The guy unhappy with his job.
Yeah. 5 years of psychoanalysis telling him his dissatisfaction with U.S. foreign policy was really about hating his father. Because, the government is a, quote, father image. Frankl talks to him, realizes the guy's will to meaning is just genuinely frustrated by his career. He wanted different work. He changes jobs, and boom, contented for years. Frankl even doubts it was a neurotic condition at all. He makes a crucial point. Suffering isn't always pathology. Struggling with the meaning of your life, that existential distress, isn't necessarily a mental disease. It might be a sign of growth, actually.
It's a valuable perspective. The risk in medicine can sometimes be over-pathologizing normal human struggles. However, clinically distinguishing a, quote, noogenic neurosis from, say, depression presenting with feelings of meaninglessness could be complex. The symptoms might overlap significantly, even if Frankl posits different origins.
So instead of seeking a calm, tension-free life, Frankl says we actually need some tension? That sounds stressful.
Yeah, it sounds counterintuitive. He calls it new dynamics. It's not about achieving homeostasis or a tensionless state. Mental health, he says, relies on the tension between what you've achieved and what you still ought to accomplish. The gap between who you are and who you could become.
It resonates with concepts like eustress, beneficial stress, or the psychological need for challenge and growth. He uses that powerful Nietzsche quote, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." His own experience in the concentration camps backs this up. The drive to rewrite his manuscript, he believes, helped him survive typhus.
And the architect analogy? To strengthen a weak arch, you increase the load. Similarly, therapists shouldn't shy away from challenging patients with potential meaning to create that healthy tension.
Okay, but what about the opposite? That feeling of total emptiness Frankl calls the existential vacuum.
Oh, yeah, the vacuum. He sees it as a huge issue, especially in the 20th century, stemming from losing our animal instincts and our guiding traditions. No instinct tells him what he has to do, and no tradition tells him what he ought to do. Instead, he either wishes to do what other people do, conformism, or he does what other people wish him to do, totalitarianism. Sound familiar?
Oof. Yeah, a little too familiar. And he links this vacuum to boredom, the Sunday neurosis?
Exactly. When the rush of the week stops, the inner emptiness becomes apparent. He connects this vacuum to depression, aggression, addiction, and says sometimes people compensate for frustrated meaning with a will to power, or money, or pleasure, like rampant sexual libido filling the void.
It's a compelling sociocultural critique wrapped in a psychological theory. You can certainly see parallels with modern discussions about consumerism, social media addiction, and the search for authenticity in a seemingly directionless world. Frankl argues that even in psychogenic cases, logotherapy is needed alongside other treatments to fill that vacuum and prevent relapse.
So how do we find this meaning then? Can a doctor just tell you the meaning of your life?
Nope. Frankl insists meaning is specific to each person, moment by moment. There's no general answer. It's like asking a chess master for the best move in the world. It depends entirely on the situation. He flips the question. Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked. Life questions us.
Wow, okay, that puts the responsibility back on us.
Totally. Responsibleness is key. His categorical imperative is, live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. It makes you aware of life's finiteness and the finality of your choices.
This emphasis on responsibility and choice is central. Logotherapy aims to make the patient aware of their responsibility, but doesn't dictate what they should be responsible for, or to society, conscience, a higher power. That's up to them. The logotherapist is an ophthalmologist, broadening the patient's view of potential meanings, not a painter imposing their own view.
And it involves, quote, self-transcendence, meaning is found out there in the world, in causes or loving others, not by focusing inward. Self-actualization, he says, is just a side effect of forgetting yourself in service to something bigger.
Okay, so where do we look for meaning? He gives 3 ways.
Right, 3 main avenues. 1, by creating a work or doing a deed, achievement. 2, by experiencing something or encountering someone, like beauty, truth, nature, or crucially, loving another person in their uniqueness.
And love? He sees it as pretty fundamental?
Absolutely. He says love is the only way to grasp another's essence, to see their potential, and even help them actualize it. It's primary, not just a sublimation of sex. Sex is an expression of love, justified only when it's a vehicle for that connection.
That's a decidedly humanistic, almost romantic view of love, compared to, say, purely evolutionary or psychoanalytic perspectives that might emphasize its reproductive or drive-based functions more heavily.
Okay, achievement love. What's the 3rd way? This is the one that really stands out from Frankl's experience, isn't it?
Yes, the 3rd way is through the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. When you face a situation you absolutely cannot change, like an incurable illness, the challenge becomes to change yourself. To bear witness to the human potential to turn tragedy into triumph.
He tells that incredibly moving story about the grieving doctor.
The elderly GP depressed after his wife's death, Frankl asks him, what would have happened if you had died first, and your wife would have had to survive you? The doctor realizes his survival, his mourning, spared her that immense suffering. Suddenly, his own suffering gains meaning, the meaning of a sacrifice. Frankl says, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning.
It's crucial to highlight Frankl's caveat here. Suffering is not necessary for meaning. If suffering is avoidable, the meaningful thing is to remove its cause. Unnecessary suffering is, quote, masochistic rather than heroic. The meaning comes from bravely facing the unavoidable.
Yes, thank you, Ethan. That's so important. And he quotes Edith Weishaupt Jolson about our culture making people unhappy about being unhappy. ashamed of suffering, instead of seeing it potentially as ennobling. Frankl found meaning even in the camp, remembering the discovery of the Hebrew prayer page when his manuscript was lost, challenging him to live his ideas, and wrestling with whether suffering itself had meaning, because if not, survival was meaningless too.
Wow. Okay, let's pause here for a second. Thinking about finding meaning, taking responsibility for our lives, even our health, it actually connects really well to our sponsor for this episode. We're supported by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, or PCRM. They're a nonprofit with over 17,000 physician members, advocating for a shift in healthcare, focusing on prevention over pills, particularly for chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. They champion plant-based nutrition and empower patients to take control, to make conscious choices about their health, which feels very aligned with Frankl's idea of taking responsibility for our attitude and finding meaning in our choices.
That's a great connection, James. Taking charge of your health through nutrition is definitely a way of finding meaning and purpose in how you live day to day. It's proactive.
And PCRM's work on alternatives to animal testing also speaks to a broader sense of responsibility towards ethical scientific practices and animal welfare. It reflects a considered stance on our relationship with the world around us. Definitely worth learning more about their work.
Absolutely. You can find out more about how PCRM is working towards a healthier future for people and animals at pcrm.org. That's pcrm.org. We thank them for their support. All right, back to Frankl's toolbox. He talks about specific techniques logotherapy uses, like paradoxical intention. This sounds wild.
It really does. It's based on two observations. 1, anticipatory anxiety. Fear brings about the thing you're afraid of. Like fearing blushing makes you more likely to blush. 2, hyperintention. Forcing something makes it impossible. Like trying too hard to fall asleep, or, perform sexually.
The fear is mother of the event. I like that. So how does paradoxical intention work?
You basically invite the patient to intend to do the very thing they fear, even for a moment. Like the doctor afraid of sweating? Frankl told him, next time, deliberately try to show people how much you can sweat. Tell yourself, I only sweated out a quart before, but now I'm going to pour at least 10 quarts.
And it worked. He just decided to sweat gallons and then didn't?
Yep. Within a week, the 4-year phobia was gone. By paradoxically wishing for it, the fear loses its power. It takes the wind out of the anxiety's sails. Same with the writer's cramp. Try to scribble as badly as possible, and suddenly you can't. Or the stutterer, who could only speak fluently when he tried to stutter to get sympathy.
It leverages humor and self-detachment. The patient learns to put distance between themselves and the neurosis, even laugh at it. Gordon Allport's quote fits perfectly. The neurotic who learns to laugh at himself may be on the way to self-management, perhaps to cure. From a cognitive behavioral perspective, it has elements of exposure therapy combined with cognitive restructuring, changing the relationship to the feared thought or sensation.
And Frankl says it can work even for severe, long-term obsessive-compulsive disorders, like the woman with the 60-year washing compulsion who learned to, quote, joke about it. It's also used for insomnia. Instead of hyper-intending to sleep, paradoxically intend to stay awake as long as possible.
He's clear it's not a panacea, but a useful tool, especially for phobias and OCD driven by that anticipatory anxiety feedback loop. Interestingly, he claims its effectiveness is independent of the original cause, suggesting current maintaining factors, like the anxiety cycle itself, are key targets for intervention.
So, break the cycle with paradox, but ultimately, long-term cure needs?
Self-transcendence. Counteracting hyperintention and hyperreflection needs dereflection, focusing away from yourself and towards your meaning, your mission in life.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. Frankl talks about a collective neurosis of our time, the existential vacuum again, and criticizes pandeterminism. What's that about?
He worries about the view that man is nothing but the product of biology, psychology, sociology, heredity, and environment. He calls this pandeterminism and says it feeds neurotic fatalism, the feeling of being a victim. He argues fiercely that man is ultimately self-determining. We aren't free from conditions, but we are free to take a stand towards them.
This touches on the age-old free will versus determinism debate. While science explores the biological and environmental factors influencing behavior, Frankl emphasizes the human capacity to rise above those conditions, to choose one's attitude and actions. His own camp experiences are his primary evidence, seeing people behave like swine while others behaved like saints under the same horrific conditions.
And that incredible story of Dr. J, the mass murderer of Steinhoff during the Nazi euthanasia program, who later, dying in a Soviet prison, became the, quote, best comrade, offering consolation and living by the highest moral standards. Frankl asks, how can we dare to predict the behavior of man? We can predict machines, maybe psychic mechanisms, but man is more than psyche.
That's quite a story of change. So freedom is crucial, but it's not the whole picture?
Right. Freedom is only half the truth. The other half, the positive aspect, is responsibleness. Freedom is in danger of degenerating into mere arbitrariness, unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness. He jokes about needing a statue of responsibility on the West Coast to balance the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast.
I love that. So ultimately, Frankl's calling for a more humanized psychiatry?
Absolutely, moving beyond seeing the patient as just a, quote, damaged brain machine. His, quote, a psychiatric credo is that even an incurably psychotic person retains human dignity because their innermost core remains untouched. Psychiatry is worthwhile because the human being is more than the illness.
It's a powerful humanistic call that remains relevant, the need to see the person behind the diagnosis, to acknowledge their potential for choice, meaning, and dignity, regardless of their condition or circumstances. The final image he leaves us with is stark but profound.
Man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips. It hinges on decisions, not just conditions.
Phew. Okay. Deep breaths, everyone. That was a lot, but incredibly powerful stuff. Let's see if we can tackle a few questions that have come in. First one. How can I apply logotherapy principles in my everyday life, even if I don't feel I have a neurosis? Sarah?
Oh, great question. I think it's about consciously asking yourself, what demands is this situation making of me? What meaning can I find right now? It could be in your work, in a conversation with a loved one, in appreciating a moment of beauty, or in how you choose to face a difficulty. It's about cultivating that awareness of responsibility and potential meaning in the small moments, not just waiting for some grand purpose to appear.
I'd add focusing on self-transcendence. Actively look for ways to contribute, to connect with others, or engage with values that are bigger than your own immediate concerns. Shifting focus outward can itself be therapeutic and meaning-generating, regardless of whether one identifies as, quote, neurotic.
All right, next question. Frankl distinguishes existential frustration from mental illness, but how does one tell the difference in practice, especially if someone feels deeply hopeless? Ethan, maybe?
That's the challenging clinical question. While Frankl's distinction is conceptually useful, in practice, severe hopelessness and meaninglessness are core symptoms of clinical depression. A key difference might lie in the context and potential triggers. Is the feeling tied to specific life circumstances or a broader philosophical questioning versus pervasive anhedonia and functional impairment? Often, it might be a mix. Professional assessment is crucial here to rule out or treat underlying illness. But even then, exploring meaning and values, as logotherapy suggests, can be a vital part of recovery.
Makes sense. One more. Logotherapy seems to touch on spirituality, especially with the super-meaning concept. Does one need to be religious to benefit from it?
Not at all. Frankl himself worked with religious figures like the rabbi, using their existing beliefs. But he also emphasized that the, quote, super meaning is beyond rational grasp. It's more about accepting the limits of our understanding while still believing in an ultimate potential meaning. For some, that might be God. For others, it could be a commitment to humanity, to nature, to ethical principles. The core idea is finding something beyond yourself to be responsible to, and that doesn't have to be supernatural.
Excellent. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, Sarah, could you give us the key takeaways from logotherapy in a nutshell?
Sure. I'd say, 1. Our primary drive is the will to meaning. 2. Meaning is unique to each person and moment, and we find it through creation/deeds, experiences/love, and our attitude towards unavoidable suffering. 3. Life constantly questions us, demanding a responsible answer. 4. Healthy tension, no dynamics, is vital for mental health, while the quote, existential vacuum leads to distress. 5. Techniques like paradoxical intention can help overcome neurotic cycles by using humor and self-detachment. And finally, humans are ultimately self-determining, free to choose their stance towards any condition, and this capacity for meaning and responsibility defines our humanity.
Brilliantly summarized. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ethan, for navigating that with us.
Profoundly thought-provoking text.
Always a pleasure.
So, listeners, what did you think? What should Penplexity tackle next? Let us know. Find us on social media @Penplexity or visit our website, penplexity.com. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and maybe keep searching for meaning. Bye for now. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get perplexed by print and try to unperplex it together. I'm your host, James, and today we're diving into something a bit, well, profound? We're looking at the postscript from 1984 in Viktor Frankl's classic, Man's Search for Meaning. The chapter is called The Case for a Tragic Optimism. Sounds cheery, right? And who better to help us navigate these slightly murky waters than our regulars? We've got the fantastic Sarah, who always knows how to break down the big ideas.
Hey James, happy to be here. And yeah, tragic optimism. It definitely makes you pause, doesn't it? But it's surprisingly powerful stuff.
And of course, bringing the scientific scrutiny and the occasional witty yet slightly concerning observation, it's Ethan.
Greetings, carbon-based life forms. Tragic optimism sounds like an oxymoron designed by a committee that couldn't agree. Or perhaps, just perhaps, a reflection of the inherent paradox of conscious existence. Let's dissect.
Okay, Dr. Ethan, let's hold off on the full dissection just yet. Sarah, kick us off. What exactly is this tragic optimism Frankl is talking about?
Right, so Frankl basically says tragic optimism means staying optimistic, finding a yes to life, despite what he calls the, quote, tragic triad. And that triad is, pretty heavy. It's pain, guilt, and death. The big three.
Pain, guilt, and death. Yeah, that's not exactly sunshine and rainbows. How can you be optimistic in the face of that?
Well, that's the core question, isn't it? Frankl argues that life holds potential meaning under any circumstances, even the absolute worst. And the key is our human capacity to, transform the negative stuff, to make the best of it. Optimum is Latin for best, hence tragic optimism.
Making the best of it. While pragmatically sound, one must question if optimism is truly the operative state. Is it optimism, or is it resilience? Acceptance coupled with purposive action? The nomenclature feels slightly imprecise, perhaps aimed at palatability.
Oh, I see what you mean, Ethan, but Frankl frames it specifically around potential. He says this tragic optimism allows for three things. 1, turning suffering into a human achievement. 2, using guilt as a chance to change yourself for the better. And 3, seeing life's transitoriness, the fact that it ends, as a reason to act responsibly now.
Okay, let's break that down. Turning suffering into achievement. That sounds difficult, especially when you're, actually suffering.
Totally. And Frankl is very clear. He's not saying suffering is good or necessary for meaning. He emphasizes that if suffering is avoidable, the meaningful thing is to get rid of its cause. Unnecessary suffering? That's masochism, not heroism, he says. But if you can't change the situation, like an incurable illness or, being in a concentration camp, you can still choose your attitude towards it. That's where the potential for meaning comes in.
He gives that example, right? Of Jerry Long, the quadriplegic guy?
Exactly. Jerry Long. Paralyzed from the neck down after an accident, but he learns to type with a mouth stick, takes college courses, reads, writes. And he actually wrote to Frankl saying, "I view my life as being abundant with meaning and purpose. I broke my neck, it didn't break me." He found meaning through his suffering, turning it into a sort of triumph.
An N of 1, while compelling, requires cautious interpretation. The psychological mechanisms enabling such post-traumatic growth are complex. There's cognitive reappraisal, benefit finding, but there's also the risk of survivorship bias. We highlight the Jerry Longs, but many others facing similar tragedies may not achieve that same perspective. It doesn't invalidate their suffering or lack of perceived meaning.
That's a fair point, Ethan. Frankl acknowledges that too. He talks about the POWs in Vietnam. Many found it a, quote, experience despite horrific stress. But he also mentions give-up-itis in POW camps and in concentration camps. People who just lost all meaning orientation and succumbed, often very quickly. It shows the potential is there, but it's not guaranteed, and it's certainly not easy.
Yeah, that give-up-itis part is chilling. He links it to the no-future generation and drug use too, right? Like a lack of meaning leading to seeking immediate destructive pleasure?
He calls it the existential vacuum, this feeling of meaninglessness, emptiness. He says it's a huge issue in modern industrial societies. People have enough to live by, but nothing to live for. They have the means, but no meaning. And he links this vacuum to what he calls the mass neurotic triad: depression, aggression, and addiction.
The correlation between perceived meaninglessness and these pathologies is well documented, as Frankl cites with Yalom's research and the Vienna statistics. However, correlation is not causation. Meaninglessness might be a symptom, a cause, or part of a feedback loop. Frankl is careful to say it's not always the cause, but suggests meaning orientation can be protective, even against suicide.
He talks about telling suicidal patients that maybe, just maybe, things could turn around, and they need to survive to see that day.
Yeah, putting the responsibility for survival back on them, giving them a potential future meaning, however uncertain. It's about finding that why to live.
Which brings us to something else. Frankl emphasizes you can't force optimism or happiness. He makes fun of the American command to be happy.
Yeah, he says happiness can't be pursued, it has to ensue. Like, it happens automatically once you find a reason to be happy, usually by finding meaning in a situation. Trying too hard to be happy is hyperintention, and it backfires. Like trying too hard to get an orgasm, he says the pleasure principle becomes a fun spoiler.
An apt analogy. The neurochemistry supports this. Pursuing pleasure directly often triggers pathways susceptible to habituation and tolerance, diminishing the reward. Whereas achieving a meaningful goal, engaging in pro-social behavior, or finding flow often activates dopamine pathways in a more sustainable, indirect way, leading to a state we might label happiness or fulfillment. Frankl intuited this mechanism.
Okay, let's pivot slightly. Guilt. How does guilt become an opportunity?
Frankl sees guilt as proof of our freedom and responsibility. If we weren't free, we couldn't be guilty. He mentions that even criminals prefer being held responsible to just being seen as, like, faulty machines needing repair. He quotes a convict saying they hate just being offered excuses. So, guilt means you did something wrong. But because you're free, you also have the chance to learn from it, to change, to grow beyond it.
The concept of mysterium iniquitatis, the inexplicable nature of a crime, is fascinating. It resists a purely deterministic view. While neurobiology and sociology can illuminate contributing factors to criminal behavior, reducing it entirely to these factors negates agency. Frankl champions this agency, this responsibility, as fundamental to being human.
But he's strongly against collective guilt, right? Like blaming a whole group for the actions of some.
Oh, vehemently. He uses that funny example of the woman asking how he could write in German, Hitler's language, and he asks her if she uses kitchen knives, even though murderers use knives. It's about individual responsibility, not assigning blame based on group identity.
Makes sense. And the last part of the triad, death or life's transitoriness. How is that supposed to make us optimistic?
Well, not optimistic about death itself, maybe, but seeing its reality as an incentive. Because life is finite, each moment is unique and won't come again. This, Frankl says, challenges us to use each moment well, to act responsibly. He even has this imperative: live as if you were living for the second time and had acted as wrongly the first time as you are about to act now. Whoa.
That's intense. Like instant accountability.
Totally! But he also flips the script on transitoriness. He says we focus too much on the stubble fields of the future passing away and forget the full granaries of the past. Everything we've done, the meanings we've fulfilled, the love we've experienced, even the suffering we've faced with courage. It's rescued into the past, stored safely, and nobody can take it away. Old people, he argues, shouldn't be pitied. They should be envied for their rich past.
An interesting reframing of temporal perspective. Typically, humans exhibit future orientation bias, especially younger individuals. Frankl proposes a revaluation of the past, not as lost potential, but as actualized reality. This could have implications for mitigating anxieties related to aging and mortality.
This whole discussion about finding meaning, taking responsibility, choosing our attitude, it really makes you think about how we approach our own lives, our own health even. Which, actually, speaking of taking responsibility for health, let's talk about our sponsor for this episode, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, or PCRM. They're a nonprofit doing really important work, combining physician expertise with massive public support, nearly 1 million members. What they do really resonates with Frankl's ideas, I think. PCRM focuses on prevention over pills for chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and cancer. They advocate for plant-based nutrition, empowering people to take control of their health. That's taking responsible action, right? Finding meaning in actively caring for yourself.
Oh, absolutely. It's about choosing your approach to health, much like Frankl talks about choosing your attitude towards suffering. PCRM gives people the tools and knowledge to make proactive, positive choices. And it's not just about personal health. They're also leaders in finding ethical alternatives to animal testing and research. That speaks volumes about responsibility on a broader scale.
Indeed, the emphasis on evidence-based preventative medicine aligns with a rational, responsible approach to well-being. Furthermore, pioneering ethical research methodologies demonstrates a commitment to progress that considers the broader impact of scientific endeavors, a form of collective responsibility, perhaps, that Frankl might appreciate in contrast to collective guilt. Their work seems deeply congruent with fostering a healthier, more consciously responsible society.
Well said, Ethan. So, if you want to learn more about how PCRM is working towards a healthier future for people and animals through nutrition, prevention, and ethical science, please visit pcrm.org. That's pcrm.org.
Definitely check them out. Empowering stuff.
A worthy exploration for those seeking actionable paths towards well-being. pcrm.org.
All right, back to Frankl. One thing that really stood out was his warning about confusing dignity with usefulness.
Yes, this is so crucial. He slams modern society's achievement orientation, how we adore the young, successful, and happy, and tend to ignore everyone else. He says a person's value, their dignity, is unconditional. It comes from the values they've realized in their past, their potential, their very being, not just their current usefulness to society.
And he links confusing dignity with usefulness directly to nihilism, the idea that everything is meaningless. If value only comes from usefulness, then what about the old, the sick, the disabled? He warns this thinking leads down a slippery slope towards justifications for things like the Nazi euthanasia programs, mercy killing, for those deemed socially useless. A chilling but logically sound extrapolation.
It's a powerful defense of inherent human worth, regardless of circumstance. He really pushes back against any philosophy that diminishes that.
He ends on a pretty stark note, referencing Auschwitz and Hiroshima.
Since Auschwitz, we know what man is capable of, and since Hiroshima, we know what is at stake. It's a call to be alert, to recognize both the depths of human cruelty and the immense consequences of our actions now. He says the world is in a bad state, and it'll get worse unless each of us does our best. He challenges us to join the minority of decent people.
A somber yet potent conclusion. It encapsulates the tragic aspect, acknowledging the horrors, while simultaneously issuing a call to action, embodying the optimism rooted in responsible choice and the potential for good, however difficult or rare.
Wow, okay. Heavy stuff, but strangely uplifting in a way? Let's take a couple of questions that have come in. First one, isn't tragic optimism just a fancy way of saying put a positive spin on terrible things, like toxic positivity? Sarah?
That's a great question. I think the key difference is that Frankl isn't about ignoring the tragedy or pretending it's not bad. It's not about just thinking positive. It's about acknowledging the pain, the guilt, the reality of death, but still actively searching for and creating meaning within that reality. It's about agency and choice in your attitude and actions, not just slapping a happy sticker on suffering.
Precisely. It's not about spin. It's about orientation, orienting oneself towards potential meaning and responsible action, even when faced with irreducible suffering. Toxic positivity often invalidates the negative experience. Tragic optimism validates the tragedy, but denies its ultimate power to destroy meaning.
All right, next question. How does this apply if someone feels completely overwhelmed and crushed by their suffering? Telling them to find meaning might feel impossible or invalidating. Ethan, maybe?
A critical point. Frankl himself worked with severely depressed patients. The application isn't a simplistic command, find meaning now. It's about holding on to the possibility that meaning can be found, perhaps in the smallest of things, perhaps in the future. It might involve enduring, surviving, finding meaning in the sheer act of carrying on. And crucially, it doesn't preclude seeking help, therapy, support systems. The search for meaning isn't necessarily a solitary burden. Sometimes, the meaning is found in reaching out or allowing oneself to be helped.
And remembering the quote potential part, Frankl emphasizes life potentially has meaning. It might not be obvious, it might take time, it might be incredibly hard, but the potential remains. Even just holding on to that possibility can be a lifeline.
Okay, last question. Frankl talks a lot about individual responsibility, but what about huge systemic problems like poverty or discrimination that cause suffering and limit opportunities? Isn't focusing only on individual attitude letting the systems off the hook?
That's really important. Frankl's focus is primarily on the individual's inner freedom and choice of attitude, because that's the last freedom that can't be taken away, even in extreme situations. I don't think he's saying systemic issues don't matter, or that we shouldn't fight to change them. In fact, doing a deed or creating a work, one of his avenues to meaning, could absolutely involve working for social change. But his core message is about what you can do, how you can respond, within whatever reality you face, however unjust it might be.
His framework operates primarily at the level of existential psychology. It addresses the individual's confrontation with the givens of existence. While acknowledging external constraints is vital for a complete sociological or political analysis, Frankl's contribution is in exploring the domain of inner response. One could argue that finding meaning and exercising responsibility includes advocating for systemic change, if that's where one's values and capabilities lead.
Great answers. So, pulling this all together, Sarah or Ethan, can one of you give us the key takeaways from Frankl's tragic optimism?
I can synthesize. Key takeaways. 1. Tragic optimism posits that meaning in life is possible despite inherent suffering, guilt, and death. 2. Meaning can be found through creative works/deeds, through experiences/love, and crucially, through the attitude taken towards unavoidable suffering. 3. Happiness is a byproduct of meaning, not a goal to be pursued directly. Hyperintention is counterproductive. 4. Humans possess an unconditional dignity distinct from mere societal usefulness. 5. The existential vacuum, or feeling of meaninglessness, is a widespread modern issue potentially leading to depression, aggression, and addiction. 6. Life's transitoriness challenges us to act responsibly, and our past actions and experiences constitute an irrevocable treasure.
Nicely done, Ethan. Concise and, synthesized. Well, that's all the time we have for today's Penplexity. Huge thanks to Sarah and Ethan for helping us wrestle with some incredibly deep ideas.
My pleasure, James. Always fascinating.
Stimulating, as always.
So, what should we get perplexed by next time? Let us know. Hit us up on social media at Penplexity. That's PENPLEXITY. Or visit our website, penplexity.com. Give us a follow, drop a comment. Tell us what book or chapter is making your brain do backflips. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and try to find that meaning, even when things get tragically complex. Bye for now.